Being handed a pretty serious topic for the month by my friend here. Reconnecting with our source. That's kind of like, wow. So we're going to be speaking for the next, tonight and the next 3 weeks on the subject. And so tonight will be an introduction to where we're going. But over the next 3 weeks, we'll probably end up covering a number of things that we have not yet ever covered. And so it'll no doubt be quite interesting for a large number of people. So tonight we're dealing with the pain of isolation. Do you get the fit with the theme or no? Reconnecting and isolation. Today I read a pretty amazing news story out of the US in Florida. A mother had made a social media post about her son. Her son was 21 years old and he was autistic. So he's already an adult. And he had developed in the last number of years some real quite heavy autoimmune disorders, which meant that he wasn't allowed to sort of socialize with others, which is always something that's extremely challenging for people that have, anywhere on the autism spectrum. They have great difficulty relating or dealing with others. And this boy rarely spoke. He never volunteered any communication, but he would sometimes respond in really brief ways to his mom or his dad asking him something. And then the parents were really shocked when this boy, David, or young man, suddenly he asked a question. Would someone like me? That's pretty mind-blowing. I mean, it's something that almost everybody struggles with in different ways, whether I'm likable, and more to the point, whether I'm lovable. The process of self-realization really means coming to know your true nature. And when I talk about your true nature, I'm not talking about a cultural identity or a gender identity or an age identity or anything. Those are all temporary and passing stuff. They're not of eternal consequence. The big question is, of course, what is it that is our real nature? The process of Sankhya Yoga, was a process of being very analytical, looking at things very, very carefully. And Sankhya yogis often led in this area But all yogis, all spiritualists, ask these same questions in relation to who are we really? Who are we really? And by examining certain things that are actually very deep drives within everyone, even in this case David, who is struggling with autism, and yet the same things, of course, that we all feel and experience. So some of the drives that are really big in our is fundamentally a fear of death, which is the foundation for all fearfulness. And that is because we are by nature eternal. We are eternal beings, and the idea of death just doesn't sit well with us. We have a desire for happiness, which really drives us. Most of the things that we choose to do is either to avoid unhappiness or to try and find real happiness. And by analyzing things, we can conclude that we are fundamentally meant to exist in a state of happiness. And that's why we feel like, sort of, in many ways, when we look at these things like a fish out of water, where people feel somehow I don't belong. Even when everything's going right for me in my life and everything's cool, somehow I feel awkward or it's incomplete. You know, I mentioned to you before about that I read from a woman's blog. She was a highly qualified writer. She had a serious job. She earned a lot of money. She had what she considered a real ideal partner in life. And she's lying in bed. She wrote this blog about it. She's lying in bed, and it's like after midnight. And her partner in life is curled up behind her, and she can feel his breath on her neck. And she's feeling, I've got everything that you could want. But why do I feel this way? Why do I feel this loneliness? Why do I feel this unhappiness? And she was questioning whether there was something wrong with her. Of course, the answer is no. That desire for happiness springs from part of our eternal spiritual nature to exist in a state of ananda, great blissfulness. That's who we are. That's where we're meant to be. And once we become entangled in the material world with these bodies and their attached identities and the nature of the limited and temporary and unfulfilling relationships, it's only natural that you should feel like this is not enough. And of course, the big one, love, the desire for love, to love and be loved. But we have a deep desire for relationship. We want meaningful relationships. It's like it's a huge thing that's driving many of us. And that stands in contrast to, isolation. That isolation is not a natural thing for us and is not really considered desirable. In this world, you see that when people become isolated, a couple of things are going on. One is it often points to a crisis that they're going through, where they've become very withdrawn from others. And it points towards, a state of depression and potential suicide, in this feeling of being completely alone, utterly alone, completely isolated from others. The effects of isolation, in this case, poses risks to us both physically and mentally. Mentally we've spoken about. But in a case when a person becomes highly isolated, they tend not to eat very well, they have difficulty sleeping, their schedules become really screwed up, and their physical health actually begins to really deteriorate. We also see that forced isolation is an extreme form of punishment. Like if you've got, in the prisons where I work, if somebody is really becoming too violent and difficult to manage, they engage in physical violence and stuff, frequently it means solitary confinement. And solitary confinement is an extremely difficult thing to endure. Extremely difficult. It breaks people down. People actually become incredibly mentally stressed and unbalanced and suffer horribly. It is because this is not a natural condition. They've done a lot of studies on these kind of things. There was one that they did with monkeys where they took baby monkeys away from their mothers and kept them completely isolated in cages to study what effect it would have. And the monkeys, as they grew, were completely neurotic and just, they just were fearful of everything. They couldn't relate, they couldn't deal with things. And when they were initially introduced or reintroduced to each other, it was just like, a massive freak out for them also. They had no social skills whatsoever. So the idea of isolation for any living being is not a good thing. Because all living beings are the same. We may have different bodies, and with those different bodies, different type of intelligence and everything becomes manifest. But ultimately, anything that is living, there is a spiritual being, and there is a commonality amongst all spiritual beings. You hear in historical accounts of great emperors and kings who ruled vast empires. And people that are attracted to the idea of power and being in control think that's such a cool place to be. But in every single case, these great emperors and kings suffered from the experience of isolation, that they could not trust any single person around them, that everybody was untrustworthy. In my life, having had the opportunity to deal with royalty and stuff, I used to decorate palaces, do semi-precious stone mosaics, and it's just really amazing dealing with these people at this very top end of the world. In their own world, they look at everyone that approaches them with incredible suspicion. What do you want? Really, what do you want? What are you after? They just can't let their guard down, because every time they do, they are betrayed and hurt. And so this is like you're living in a crowd. You've got all these people around you, and you just live in this fearful state, and you are very much isolated in many ways. And then, of course, there was that famous movie, Castaway. I don't know if you remember that one from a few years back, Tom Hanks. And, he was on an island, and in his desperation to not be isolated, he created a fantasy friend, Wilson. He had this old deflated ball that he painted a face on. And he would talk to Wilson, and hang out with Wilson, and do stuff with Wilson. You know, these are not, while it was a bit of a comedy, it does point, though, to another reality that people that are subjected to extreme isolation really go through these types of experiences. So the deep spiritual reality, and what this has to do with the main theme, is that it is not natural for us to be in a state of isolation. And the practice of yoga, of true spirituality, is really about a practice of deep and meaningful connection. And some people may ask, oh, what about the ancient yogis who used to go off to the forest and live completely alone? Weren't they isolated? Weren't they living in isolation? And the short answer is no, they weren't. They may have avoided mundane relationships and mundane conversation, which didn't help them spiritually at all. But the reason they could stay in this kind of situation is because of this amazing inward journey that they would go on. So they became what were called Atmaramas. This word Atmarama means completely self-satisfied. Not in want of anything, because they were tasting something that was incredibly wonderful, spiritually transcendental. In the Bhagavad Gita, in the 5th chapter, there's a couple of verses that speak to this. Such a liberated person is not attached to material sense pleasure, but is always in samadhi, state of fixed spiritual consciousness, enjoying the pleasure within. And in this way, the self-realized person enjoys unlimited happiness, for he concentrates upon the supreme. And another verse, one whose happiness is within, who is active and rejoices within, and whose aim is inward, is actually the perfect mystic. He is liberated in the supreme, and ultimately he attains the supreme. So, in all cases, there is the desire amongst transcendentalists for a connection that is profoundly meaningful and profoundly enjoyable, pleasurable. It's not like an austere state where people are trying to cut themselves off and, deny themselves. They are drowning in an ocean of great pleasure. When I was a monk living in India, in Brahmachari, back in 1971, I was living in one of the great holy places. And I visited in this tiny little village, in this holy place, which was a center of great spirituality. I went to this place, it's called Radhakunda. And I was there sitting in my meditation and chanting. And an elder gentleman who was a deeply renounced individual. They call them Babajis, and they wear a cloth that's only from the length of the elbow to the hand, end of the hand, like a little tiny mini skirt. It's the only garment they wear, and they sometimes have a cloth around their shoulders. And they usually live by begging, and their habit is to not beg from more than 5 houses. And if they don't get anything, they don't eat. And if they do, they only accept small amounts and not to burden any others. He was a god brother of my spiritual master, and he introduced himself and treated me with some affection and kindness. And he asked me to come to his small hut, called Bhajan Kutir. It was this tiny little place. In his earlier life, he had been an artist, and he had actually painted a number of really spiritually significant paintings. And he opened this trunk and showed me some of these things, and one that he took out and unfolded it. It was of two of our great spiritual teachers. They were brothers from about 500 years ago. One was called Rupa Goswami, the other one Sanatana Goswami. And in this picture, the background was a beautiful kind of blue. And then he had these two personalities who were quite thin. Because of the austere nature of their life, you'd see the ribs, the rib cage. There wasn't anything like what I've got wearing around here. And they were really, and in one hand they had their japa beads, and in the other hand they held what used to be carried by these wandering monks, a water pot where they would carry water. And you look at their physical forms, and it looked, very lean and obviously incredibly austere. But you look at the faces, and there was just this, they were lost in this ocean of transcendental happiness. And there were actually tears, if you look closely, tears welling up and falling from their eyes, an expression of great transcendental happiness and ecstasy. And when you look at it, it was just like, it was startling, and it was so beautiful and deeply moving. And this is what I was mentioning before, that even the great spiritual personalities who appeared externally to be isolated, they were isolated from that which is mundane, and they were absolutely drowning in an ocean of spiritual blissfulness and great spiritual ecstasy. So we've talked many times about the reality that this body is not us, and the mind is not us, that I am a spiritual being. And of course, if we take that seriously, it's sort of like the next question is, okay, well, what can I actually come to know of myself? And where have I come from? What is it that I've become disconnected from? The ancient Upanishads have a very beautiful verse in the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad. And it states, just as tiny sparks fly from a fire, so all the individual souls have come from the Supreme. So, of course, what does that mean? What does it mean to be a spark? What is the nature of that spark? Is that spark just an energy? And what is this Supreme? What is the meaning of Supreme? Is the Supreme just also a form of energy? We often tend to think like that, or a lot of people think in that way. But the most common way in which the living being was addressed by Patanjali, who is considered the great rishi or sage behind the yoga system, the word that he would use is either the seer, the person who is actually Or he would use the term Purusha. Purusha literally means person. You are a person. Your body is not a person. You are the one that brings personality. You are the one that brings the life, the personhood to the body. Upon the living being leaving, immediately the body manifests its impersonal nature and is no longer attractive. So if we are sparks from a fire and we are by nature persons, then what is the nature of that ultimate source that we are emanating from? That source is also ultimately personal. There are impersonal features, energetic features from that, but ultimately it is personal in nature. And so this soul, Atma, is described as the Paramatma, the Supreme Soul, or the Param Purusha, the Supreme Purusha. The reconnection of the Atma with this Paramatma, which is our actual source from which we emanate, is what yoga is actually all about. If one does not come that far, if they remain simply on the level of being focused on the fact that I am a form of spiritual consciousness or energy, and I'm going to reconnect with some higher consciousness or energy, that is actually not a perfectly complete appreciation or understanding. The Vedas do not teach this. There have been commentators on the Vedas who promote that type of idea, but it is not actually originally a teaching from the Vedas. And so in the next few days, or over the next 3 Sundays, we will begin to explore the nature of this connection. What does it mean to reconnect with our source? What does it mean to become whole again? To find everything that we were actually looking for and desiring. That's the little journey we'll be taking. And we'll deal with some things that, as I mentioned, we have not spoken about before, that people may find very helpful in their life and also very interesting. Okay, you good with that? This is about coming home in the deepest sense. We're talking about the most wonderful and profound reconnection.
Charlie?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been in isolation.
You've been?
In isolation in the south.
Yeah.
For quite a long time. And I wonder what, this person who's feeling, someone like me, was someone that's feeling isolated, what you would recommend to do. I mean, I had certain practices that I could take and set my life up into schedules, and that way I got through it, but it was very hard.
Yeah.
I had cockroaches to talk to. But what would you advise for someone that's feeling,
Okay. I mean, this is actually where we're going with the rest of the talks. For those who are looking for shelter now, and I tell you, we are all looking for shelter. Anybody that tells me that I'm not looking for shelter, it's untrue. That's why we watch TV, that's why we watch movies, that's why we seek out companions, that's That's why we want to try different things, and that's why we take drugs or drink alcohol or do anything, is because we're seeking shelter. The greatest shelter that one can actually experience is in deep to become immersed in this process of meditation upon these transcendental sounds. And we'll address and talk about is that these sounds are not impersonal. These sounds are not just sounds, that they contain within them an amazing spiritual world, an amazing spiritual experience. And by taking shelter in this process of chanting these transcendental sounds, it is the most effective way to assuage our burning hearts, our feelings of loneliness or incompleteness. Some people experience the effect like almost immediately. Some people take a little time. You have to be patient and you have to actually become immersed. And one of the guys that I do meditation with in the Paramaribo 2 weeks ago, I mean, for him, he's telling me now that he finds this, and he's transformed. When I was leaving, one of the administrators approached me and said, "Wow, I don't know what you're doing, but this guy has like changed so much. It's just like so amazing. Please keep it up." But, I don't get very philosophical with him. He's a real simple kind of dude. He's done some really bad stuff. And he's trying to find his way through this 19-year sentence that he's got. But he's learned how to become, to really take shelter there. And when we chant together, sometimes he is just shedding tears. And of course he feels somewhat embarrassed. So I keep my eyes closed because I don't want him to feel uncomfortable. But the reason that he's not out of self-pity or anything, he's actually experiencing just amazing relief and a deep spiritual joy. And he can't understand what's going on within his own heart. And so I think in answering your question, all I can do is encourage people to really take shelter in this process, in this chanting process. It's not a simple thing. If you actually become immersed in the process, your life will absolutely transform, and the experiences that you will have cannot be compared to anything. They are everything that we desire and everything that we look for. But we'll get into more detail as we go forward. Is that okay? I mean, wasn't that your experience? That when you take shelter in this process of chanting, and those kind of conditions, and where you're really forced to take shelter, it's not like you've got any options, and it's so hellish in there. Some of the places I visited once up in New York, and the prison he was, and it was just like, it was hell. All these people just yelling and fighting, and it was just the whole time.
Thank you so much for visiting me. It was very nice.
Oh, it was a great pleasure to visit you and chant with you and that. Okay, so we will do a little chanting, because that's, I think it's going to make a difference. And we'll chant the mantra Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. way.